there's a lot of Indigenous knowledge being fed into this project, some of which I'm acknowledging. There are great problems, I think, with white Western men taking over Indigenous wisdom and making it our own. If we don't, then we fail. But if we do, it's more theft, and God knows Indigenous people have suffered enough at our hands. So bear with me. I've taken out pretty much all the referencing of footnotes in this as well. I'm going to start with some observations on wealth. Private property is founded on privation, the power to deprive others. What I accumulate, I deny to you. My wealth depends on excluding you from it. My anxiety is that you might steal it, or that an undefined they may devalue it. These anxieties encourage me to acquire more and stash it away. To ensure I amass more, I deny first your pleasures and then my own. This is why misers are miserable. In the olden days, the miserable built castles with their accumulated wealth to defend the wealth they spent building them from the people they took it from. Today, the same miserable class defend their wealth by buying space capsules so they can escape the planetary fate that they are in great part responsible for. According to Oxfam, in 2022, 252 men have more wealth than all 1 billion women and girls in Africa and Latin America and the Caribbean combined. 252 men. What we call wealth, this accumulation of private property, has not been collected for enjoyment's sake, but for the absolute contrary. Its purpose is to exclude the vast majority of the world, human and non-human, from enjoyment. Owning and owing money involves arresting time. The owner accumulates wealth, but from the point of view of wealth itself, the owner is a mere receptacle, a gravity well that wealth flows towards, a point of eternal rest without further need to circulate. For the debtor, all the money they have ever earned and will ever earn has already vanished, leaving an empty totality that can never be repaid. This second emptiness, again from the perspective of money itself, is the same as the totality and rest of accumulation. The harrowing truth of wealth as personal good thus staggers into view just at the moment of its disappearance. For wealth itself, owning and owing are simple effects of its one function, which is to disappear. From wealth's point of view, this rest state is the eternity it seeks. But economic eternity is strapped to the present, a fiscal event horizon that's perpetually now, because wealth exists, has being, possesses itself in its fullness only now in an eternal present. Past wealth is gone. Future wealth doesn't exist yet, which is why debt appears as ravenous to debtors and as lucre to creditors. Wealth tries to secure its stasis by suborning the law to its service, for example, in the form of inheritance. A succession of anonymous owners and debtors follow one another down the dusty avenues of time in service of immortalizing wealth's presence to itself. The human is utterly marginal to this process. Because wealth is impersonal, it can never serve as a personal good. We do not ultimately own it, nor in the end does it own us. It uses people as it uses any other resource. Profit is taken in the present, but wealth is accumulated from the past. Whether language and land or code and computers, the media that channel wealth share with it their origin in the commons. Marx called this immaterial commons the general intellect. The vast resources of a shared legacy of those things no individual can function or exist without, but which no individual created or could create, such as language or mathematics. I can take no claim for the English language. I use it every day. I hope that I'm adding stuff to it as I go along, as everybody who speaks it does. But nobody owns it, and yet everybody tries to own it, especially corporations. I talked about this idea to Barry Barclay, alas now deceased Maori filmmaker, who told me that the difference between his people and mine was that they knew the names of their ancestors. The general intellect is a way we can speak about ancestral skills and knowledge, our ancestral commons of language, but also the stolen skills tied up in every technology, from spinning jennies to cloud computing. As Benjamin wrote, Walter Benjamin, that is, even the dead are not safe when the enemy is victorious. Ethics and politics, which are the concern of my current project on the good, which is the manuscript that this talk is pillaged from. Ethics and politics cannot succeed unless they take on the liberation of the ancestors from their black boxes and the black hole of accumulation. If wealth is not the supreme good, what about freedom? The last time I spoke at DDI, I talked about Tsleil and QR codes. Today, I'd like to talk about Jackson Pollock, the avatar of freedom in the late 1940s, and about financialization, the objective form of the free market founded in the Mont Pelerin Declarations of 1947. I've got to be in my bonnet about the late 1940s. Between 47, when Shannon and Weaver promulgated the mathematical theory of communication, and the launch of the Macy conferences and cybernetics, the various kind of key publications in mathematics at the same point, the emergence of Pollock, amongst others, the beginnings of Cage and Stockhausen's work with chance. There's a whole bunch of interesting things that all are occurring. In many respects, I think the period 1947 to 49, 49 being the year of Indian independence, but also of partition, the year of the Chinese Revolution, the year in which Russia, the USSR, achieved its greatest geographical extent, the more or less formal launch of the Cold War. All of these things seem to me really very important to a formation which really doesn't change radically until financialization becomes a major concern in the wake, in particular, of the global financial crisis of 2007 to 8. But financialization is born in the Mont Pelerin Declarations, which were the foundations of neoliberal economics. There's a tension in Pollock's drip and pour technique between unconscious play and impersonal mechanism that places Pollock squarely in the terrain that cybernetics sought to occupy also in the late 40s, except that Pollock's networks of paint aren't governed. That's the etymological root of cybernetic govern. Cubitt is a governor. It's not governed, but they are contingent. They perform a network architecture that would not come to fruition until this century, when capital learned to harness randomness as a new source of profit, not least the random behaviors of people. In 1964, Lacan, that's not him, is just an idiot picture to kind of evoke the unconscious in some way. Lacan said that because consciousness was fundamentally linguistic, the unconscious is structured like a language. So if you accept the principle that communication shapes and is shaped by consciousness and unconsciousness, and you relate that to data harvesting in affective computing, Collecting such unconscious sources as clicks, wipes, and facial expressions, you have to admit that increasingly the unconscious is shaped like code. Not just language, but also like code. The unconscious used to make itself manifest in jokes, slips of the tongue, and talking in your sleep. Now it appears as magical interactivity and muscle memory in computational environments. The more data-like the unconscious becomes, the easier it is to harvest its behaviors online. The more it is externalized in digital networks, the more biographically formed personal unconscious becomes impersonal and collective. Because the collective unconscious is not only shaped but harvested in corporate relational databases, its obverse consciousness also becomes increasingly collective and incorporated in network technologies. No longer the privileged possession of individual humans, it is increasingly integrated in ancestral technologies. A proportion of what we consider human remains outside the system, valued as a source of unpredictable acts to be gathered and exploited by network services. Computation harvests the code-friendly dream work of its human users. In return, humans collaborate with ancestral powers to perform the dream work of computation. We are becoming more like ancestors, both of us impersons. Marx's General Intellect was an exclusively human production. Our integration into technologies and their integration into us produces a new phenomenon. I'm calling it the mass unconscious. The purpose of so many edge computing processes like QR codes is to harvest whatever they can from the noisy, contingent differences of human activities. The network is my unconscious, but it's also the case that I am the unconscious of the machinery. Edge computing succeeds when it translates human residues into a form the system can digest, numbers. But to the extent that they fail to capture, amongst many other things, euphoria or anxiety, the feeling of being alive, or the fluid creativity of living language, they also make possible the edgy, not to say uncanny, experience of the edge. The mass unconscious dreams, unhappily, of the repressions operated by all technologies as they hide their histories of extraction and enslavement. The artificial voices of chatbots channel the voices of all those whose general intellect has been siphoned into the instrumental technologization of natural and artificial languages. Social and psychological amnesia surrounds the generalized slavery of language and knowledge, and their mobilization in the shiny, always new devices and services appearing magically in advance of whims we have not yet had the chance to become aware of. Amnesia is a necessary attribute of consumption in a new era of planned obsolescence, designed to activate desire in the face of falling profits. Selective amnesia helps sell compulsory innovation when profit depends on expanding into the mass unconscious. The risk, however, is that the closer we come to face-to-face encounters with enslaved ancestors, the more fearful and repressed we become, and the less we share the unpredictability that makes human data valuable to capital. The uncanny we experience in interacting with AIs arrives when, unconscious as we have become, we confront ancestral general intellect in the moment we ourselves are becoming ancestors. When a city district gentrifies or suffers urban blight, there's a contradiction between the hard material of buildings and street layout and the new cultural lives striving to find ways to flourish in environments never designed for their purposes. Similarly, the operation of cyborg capital, dependent on planet-spanning infrastructures of supply, governance, and protocols, creates tensions between the living evolution of everyday culture and natural languages on one hand, and the far more rigid undergirding of control over communication. In both cases, urban regeneration and global infrastructures, ancestors appear twice in the universalizing tendencies of communication and transport technologies, like the logistical software that controls maritime transport. Were on the one hand, and the far more rigid underground, no, I've said that, haven't I? They also appear twice in the localizing tendencies to invent traditions and forms of dialogue. Natural languages and city neighborhoods are discrete, but they're also traversable, at least at the interpersonal level, as the history of intermarriage since Romeo and Juliet will show. Industrial digital communication technology, on the other hand, maintains far more rigid boundaries and hierarchies. They privatize the means of communication. They expropriate ancestral knowledge as intellectual property, which to my mind is a complete contradiction in terms, and force the ancestors recruited into them into slavery. Shannon's definitive separation of signal from meaning now appears as a barrier between the living and the dead. A key function of the creative practices we still keep calling art is to wreck that barrier. AI promotes a unified pseudo-utopian cosmopolis. Because this AI-driven cosmopolis is defined by the same eternal present as wealth, it has done away with any hope for a future other than the quasi-utopia it has already concluded. The failure of artificial intelligence to assimilate language, and therefore the general intellect, leaves out the embodied phenomenological affective life operating not only in individuated bodies, but between people at levels as deep or deeper than love or community. This residual exceeds exchange, thriving on the differences it generates and depends on, but for the most part, working below the threshold of language and consciousness. This continuum of sensations and activities below the threshold of consciousness, things like digestion, breathing, balance, locomotion, putting one foot in front of another, connects everything from minds to minerals and ensures all are permeable to one another at the speeds of gut flora or the speed of evolution. I'm going beyond two of my favorite sources, Marie-Louise Ungerer from Potsdam and N. Catherine Hales, and I'm going to call this general cognition. The immense reservoir of general cognition is not a resource because it's outside consciousness and therefore shielded from exploitation. I don't know about what my gut flora are doing right at the moment. I hope. I mean, if I was wildly conscious of them, there would be something terribly wrong with my digestive tract. They just do their shit. But they do it inside me. And they work in relation to everything I ingest and inhale, etc. But I'm not particularly conscious of them, especially not right at the moment. As a black box, AI has been severed from the human intellectual and cognitive processes that produced its raw materials. At the same time, human users are ignorant of it. When AI converts innumerable statements into dynamic processing, there's no longer a fixed knowledge to lay claim to, and therefore no subject of knowledge on a par with God or science to know it, let alone man with a capital M. We need non-conscious cognition because we need not to know. After the foreclosure of any future, when the future is unthinkable, we need not to think. After the foreclosure of any future. In this respect, the unknowable activities of AI processing mirror the unknowing processes of general cognition, as each in their own ways escapes the determinations of power and profit. Waste product of grinding down the previous capitalist individual The non-conscious individual no longer needs an I to mobilize desires and behaviors. Ground to data dust, the individual is prey to edge computing and regimes of control, but as an unknowing post-subject, it bleeds out of the realm of capturable consciousness and therefore out of the realm of a general intellect, moving towards this general cognition. Language is unsettled by its new escape from discourse and its new proximity to non-human code. Bereft of future or goal, the decentered individual undergoes seismic tides from within and without that it experiences as anguish as often as it feels joy, both of them as affects equally inexplicable. From the point of view of any efficient system, the dusty flux of general cognition appears chaotic and intimidating, but it only turns into noise when it touches on the boundaries of edge computing. And you can see some of those edges in this schematic of an AI. As the place of encounter with an outside, noise is congruent with, that's to say, it shares the same shape as trust. Trust only extends to the like-minded. And even then, it must be earned, and it can be lost. Trust is as incomplete and ephemeral as the noise it attempts to distinguish itself from. The communicative, efficient cosmopolis of AI similarly oscillates between trust and distrust, acceptance and rejection of sources and resources, order and noise, and defines itself in relation to the untrustworthy flux of its externalities. But like a human community, AI must develop protocols of self-definition in order to police its borders for maximum efficiency. You've got to have edges. Otherwise, you can't be what you are. But the fact that you have edges means you're going to be in friction with the things that are beyond it. Now, something similar happens. Oh, sorry, I missed my cognitive processing. There's somebody's gut flora, not mine. Something similar happens when contemporary neo-fascist movements mobilize rage in order to re-socialize the anguish of deracination by providing new inbred communal nodes with imagined traditions. Claiming such uprooted traditions as their unique property is a prime condition for making a proto-fascist community a magnet for deracinated, unaffiliated others, providing them with a tradition they lost in the era of suburbanization, or in the case of India or Brazil, in the transition from colony to neocolonialism. Once, political movements and subcultures provided experience of belonging to those emerging from the failures of post-war regimes. Now, predatory neo-fascism does the same by creating out of nothing trust groups capable of abandoning whatever is incomprehensible, such as climate change or migration or queers or Islam, whatever is unrecognizable to the instrumentalized general intellect. The great comfort in this is that the invention of tradition mobilizes forms of imagination that cannot necessarily be contained by the neo-fascist forces that unleash them. So it makes us imagine community, but it can't necessarily contain the imagination. The alternative is to realize the difficult autonomy that Pollock strove for, but which succumbed to art world ideologies of freedom and authorship. Through the 20th century, the aesthetics of the avant-garde rested on Paul Klee's bon mot, "the people are missing." Those of you who read Deleuze will recognize that quote. Creating unprecedented objects and experiences was always geared towards a conception of future audiences who would at last be ready to inhabit them. Deferring the realization of the art experience to an indefinite future was a potent salve for the ruins of the wars that extended from 1914 well past the fragile peace of 1945. But it was always based on the promise of jam tomorrow. Pollock's paintings no doubt fall under the same aesthetic deferral, but the work of making them, the dynamism of producing in the interaction of tradition, the general intellect, intuitions of networks, a mass unconscious, and sheer bodily enjoyment entangled in materials, general cognition, refuse to postpone enjoyment into a future that, however strongly we may hope, may never arrive. Pollock teaches us to demand the future now. There is a longing in belonging, a longing for whatever, wherever opens onto an unattainable future. General cognition is closer to loving than it is to the management of public affairs. Belonging is constitutively incomplete, like any longing. Origin, tradition, even agreements have to be discarded in the yearning for something better, other, elsewhere, and future. Articulations of instrumentalized ancestral skills and knowledge in digital networks and enraged communities are not only self-contradictory. My freedom demands that you abandon control over your body, for instance, or my right to shoot overrides your right to live. But it's also incomplete and incoherent and incomplete. That's a reference to Gödel for the mathematicians in the room. This powers capital's constant stirring of the pot of resentment and its push towards edge computing and the promised harvest of non-conscious cognition. As communications technologies colonize the mass unconscious, they also bring the living into closer proximity to the dead, opening new possible alliances. The more individual humans abandon consciousness in favor of general cognition, the closer they come to the natural processes that have always permeated their bodies and their relationships. When the non-conscious and the mass unconscious evade capital's colonial embrace, they flee further beyond freedom. That's a phrase to conjure with. Beyond rights, beyond equivalence, into the incomprehensible, the ephemeral, and the purely imaginary. A world of untapped political potential. The lack of an alternative to capital and its trajectory towards planetary annihilation shrivels any imagination of living otherwise. Oh, sorry, that's missed that cue. Since the 1948 Macy conferences, that shriveled imagination has been dominated by systems thinking. Economics has become a cyborg science dependent on simulations and models rather than observation, blurring distinctions between physical and historical social processes and reducing agency to information processing. Also in 1948, science administrator William Vogt set out the principles of Earth system science. We have set in motion historical forces that are directed by our total environment, he wrote. We must stop blaming economic systems, the weather, bad luck, or callous saints. The basics of Vogt's Earth system science are the universal power of numbers and a belief that capitalism is not to be questioned and that control must be exercised. By 2000, this is the newsletter in which the word Anthropocene first appeared, but you'll see that the editorial is about Earth systems in the year 2000, by which time Earth system science is absolutely settled, and the concept of the Anthropocene is emergent inside a system scientific frame. This is from that editorial. The Earth functions as a system with properties and behaviors that are characteristic of the system as a whole. Systems thinking, this is me now, by now tends to ignore and in policy practice to sacrifice local ecologies to the abstract concept of a single planetary ecology. And you'll find that, for example, in the idea of carbon offsets. Economic systems reduce humans to information processors. Even the vocabulary of technology and environment is symptomatic of our terrible separation from both and of efforts to keep us separate from them. Beyond the equilibrium that systems thinking always treasures, beyond its eternal efficient present, we need a new vocabulary. Once we understand technology as our ancestors, we can begin to understand land, rivers, forests, storms, and fires as gods. We ingest, inhale, and inhabit ancient land, older than our species. We hold and are held by technologies as old as language, clothes, and shelter. Gods and ancestors ingest, inhale, and inhabit us. We experience one another as affect, tidal forces running through us that can be intelligible, hallucinatory, or physical, personal, collective, and environmental by turns or simultaneously. These are the raw energies driving imagination, or restoring it after systems thinking. Think of it as projection. Leibniz once, writing about projective geometry, said that God can see everything simultaneously, but humans are so limited they can only see from one perspective at a time. But that's projection already. It's a possibility of thinking. What happens when we reach a point where there is no absolute, no God, there's no man or science or even a system, but every perspective is not only relative, but relevant and emanates from non-humans as well as humans. Imagination today embraces this multiplication of the scopic field, where every impression matters, from the river's cognition of its banks to the sun's view of Venus. Politically, it implies a sensory commons, an ununified general cognition suffusing the general intellect to produce a general imagination. That's my rabbit out of the hat then. The general imagination embraces the cognitive and sensory capabilities of the entire cosmos. In the same way that imagined communities become historical realities, imagining a common experiential universe may bring it into existence. Dreaming that comes into existence with no idea of its consequences is as risky as liberating locked-in ancestral labor, including code. I mean, it's as great a risk as the currently dominant shriveled imaginary, which can see no alternative to the economic suicide of the species. So there, we are in the same position as Pascal in the famous wager when he says we really have to wager on believing in God, because either God exists, in which case we might go to hell, so we really better sort of agree that he's there, or we could just bet against God, but in that case we're definitely going to hell. So it's the status quo is committed to terminal planetary collapse, so we may as well bet against it. Even as it creates a global epidemic of mental illness, cyborg capital is itself becoming increasingly obsessive and paranoid. After all their centuries locked into the anonymous black boxes of computers, there is the possibility that the ancestors may be mad. After all their centuries. Well, watching the carnival of destruction wrought by floods, fires, and pandemic in the 2020s, it seems that all the violence visited on it may finally have driven the ecology mad too. Shattered, scattered, subject to unmanageable energies, sometimes huddling to protect itself, sometimes shrieking in pain and running amok. Schizo, in fact, like me, or any other human in the digital age. No one said becoming unconscious was going to be easy or fun. The book I'm working on has 3 digressions. One is on posthumous artifacts designed to live on after the human extinction, on apathy as a strategy of resignation and refusal, and on nostalgic politics trying to restore a lost wholeness. These are strategies for defeating despair. not for building a future. Conversely, my proposed route from general intellect through mass unconscious to general cognition and thence to the general imagination gets increasingly difficult to describe the further it gets from language and consciousness, because everything I've been saying suggests that if the general intellect is about where language and maths, logic come from, then by the time I'm talking about these other non-human processes, then language is clearly not the right medium to try and describe it. Well, staying in linguistic consciousness isn't an option because it's already under control. People who witness, oh, there's my picture for those. Posthumous media like the Voyager Golden Disc, apathy, and then this wonderful image of nostalgia for Canucks in the audience of a certain generation. This image always makes me think of the tragically hip song Bob Cajun, about the two gay cops. People who witnessed Pollock at work describe him in constant motion, concentrating intensely, lost in what would become known as action painting. He spent enough time among surrealists to advance techniques for accessing his unconscious. He was energetic enough to bring his whole body, gesture, rhythm, breath, his non-conscious cognition into play. He also succumbed willingly to ancestral techniques of paint and canvas. For example, once he'd finished working on the floor, putting them up on the wall like a traditional painting. And he succumbed willingly to natural processes like viscosity and gravity. At work beyond intellect, unconscious, and even cognition, action painting, circumscribed as it was by its times, but inspired by its technical and natural ecologies, intuits what a political imagination might be like. To propel the planet out of the black hole of accumulation demands these collaborative energies to create in the darkest hour a common imagination capable of bringing another world into reality. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Thank you.